200,000 miles on a vehicle is a lot. What about 300,000? Is it even worth fixing up? Or should you just get rid of it? Well, let's take a look at a 300,000 mile vehicle and see what needs to be done. Over 300,000 miles and over 9,000 hours of use on this 2003 Chevrolet Suburban. With all original steering and front end parts, it's not surprising at all that the steering is extremely sloppy and loose. And this 2003 Chevrolet Suburban is a little dirty, but it doesn't look too bad once it's cleaned up, at least for the most part. However, there is an area on the passenger side wheel arch that has quite a bit of rust. Unfortunately, this area is completely rotted out. This wheel arch was repaired about 15 years ago before I purchased the vehicle, so I don't anticipate having an issue on the other side of the vehicle since it's never been damaged. Let's go ahead and lift this corner of the vehicle off the ground. I'll support the vehicle with the jack stand. The rear tire needs to come off the vehicle anyway since we're going to go ahead and replace the rear brakes. Once the screws and the fender lining clips are out of the way, the fender lining will come right out. At a price of around $75, I purchased a wheel arch patch to make the repair. I'll place a vertical and horizontal marker line to serve as a reference point for measuring the area of the patch needed for the donor material. I'll take another measurement once I've cut out the damaged area. I'll cut out to the left and the right of the rusted area, and hopefully I won't have to cut out any more. And the damaged piece of metal is out of the way, and the metal on both sides of the damaged area appear to be in pretty good shape. I'll hang on to the damaged piece since we'll need it once again. And there's a rubber or foam lining that runs along the inside of the fender. I'll have to be very careful when welding into patch so I don't start a fire. I need to sand around the cutout just to make sure that there's no more underlying rot or rust. By the way, I'm definitely not an auto body expert, and if I can do this, anyone can. Also, I'm sure that some of the people watching this video do this every day and can do a far better job and provide some great advice. So if you have some advice on how to do this better, I look forward to reading your comments in the comments section. And the donor piece seems to be sized just about right. I don't know what type of paint was used on the fender arch, so I'll go ahead and remove the paint or primer. I'll use a primer that can be applied before welding. I'll apply the primer to both sides to help prevent the donor material from corroding in the future. I'm definitely not a talented welder. You could probably do a much better job than me, but stitch welding doesn't require too much skill. To avoid catching the vehicle on fire from that rubber material on the inside of the fender, I'll have to take a lot of breaks. I'll just keep stitch welding until all the gaps and holes are filled. Let's go ahead and use an angle grinder and a flap disc to remove the high points of the weld. I had to do a little bit more welding to plug all the holes. As they say, good enough for government work. I'll use a straight edge to make sure that there aren't any high spots. Since there aren't any high spots, I'll go ahead and use an orbital sander to feather out the repair area. Definitely not the best tool for the job, but good enough for a DIY repair. One of the big mistakes that I've made in the past is to use a stirring motion when mixing the body filler. Stirring the body filler creates hundreds of little bubbles in the filler. Unfortunately, the repair area ends up having a lot of pinholes. The technique that I'm using seems to do a much better job at keeping the air bubbles out of the body filler. It's a uniform color, so I should have a couple of minutes to work with before the Bondo begins to harden. Leaving the unused body filler on the spreader is the easiest way to end up cleaning the spreader. Just give it about 5 minutes to cure and it peels right off. And an orbital sander is definitely not the best tool at this point in the repair, but I'm just knocking down the high areas. I'll apply another round of body filler to build out the low areas. I'll use an orbital sander one more time to knock down some of the high areas. People who actually do this for a living probably find this pretty funny that I'm using a 2x4 with some sandpaper. Once again, I don't have specialized equipment, so I'm going to use this 2x4 and some 220 grit sandpaper to do some sanding. Any old 2x4 will work, and about 7 to 8 inches in length will work well with a standard sheet of sandpaper cut into 3 pieces. And we're making pretty good progress, but there's more block sanding that needs to happen. By the way, for health reasons, I highly recommend wearing a good respirator to avoid inhaling the fumes or dust. The last step is to use some 400 grit sandpaper to smooth out the repaired area. The repaired area seems pretty flat and straight, so let's go ahead and clean it up and get ready to do some painting. I'll go ahead and use a tack cloth to clean up the area. So let's go ahead and use a spray primer. Using a primer sealer is a great way to prevent the top coat paint from soaking into the prime surface. I don't show it, but sanding the primer very lightly before the first top coat really helps. I was able to find a can of Krylon paint that matches the paint code for the vehicle. I'll first apply a very light coat of paint and allow it to cure for 5 to 6 minutes. I'll apply a slightly heavier second coat, but it's still a pretty light coat of paint. It's been about 7 minutes, so I'll apply a third coat of paint, a little heavier than the second coat, but I definitely don't want any paint runs. It's been almost 10 minutes, so I'll go ahead and apply a very light coat of Krylon clear coat paint to avoid causing paint runs. I waited around 7 minutes and applied a little heavier second coat of clear coat. And the third coat of clear coat is really beginning to make this repair look good. And the fourth and final coat of clear coat is the heaviest, but still not too thick to avoid a paint run. And the repaired area looks a whole lot better than it did 5 hours ago when I started the repair. I'm definitely not an auto body expert, and I don't even have the equipment the pros use. If I can do this, so can you. While the back of this vehicle is off the ground, let's go ahead and replace the rotor and brake pads. I'll start by removing two 12mm bolts that hold the caliper in place. If you take your car to a dealership, you can easily spend over $1,000 for a complete brake job, which includes changing the rotors, pads, and flushing the brake fluids. I bought genuine AC Delco rotors and ceramic brake shoes for all four wheels for around $230. I'll use a C-clamp to compress the caliper pistons. Doing the work myself is saving well over $500, and this job is pretty quick and easy. I'll set the caliper up and out of the way so that it won't fall and cause damage to the brake line. I'll use a screwdriver to separate the brake pads from the rotor. There's plenty of life left in these brake pads, but since I've already got the rotors and brakes off, I'll go ahead and replace them. Let's remove the old anti-rattle clips and install new ones that came with the brake pads. In order to remove the rotor, we need to remove the brake caliper bracket. There are two 18mm bolts, and they are typically pretty tough to break loose. Once the two bolts are removed, we can remove the brake caliper bracket and the old brake rotor. With over 300,000 miles on these brake rotors, they are in very bad shape. They have pretty deep grooves, and they're too thin to use again at 27.5mm. They're supposed to be discarded at 28.5. The new brake rotors are over 30mm in thickness. Now that the new rotor is in place, I need to clean up the brake guide pins before installing the caliper bracket. A little brake parts cleaner and the old crusty grease is coming off the guide pins. I'll apply some silicone guide pin grease to the pins. And the caliper pin boots are in good shape and they're clean. The caliper bracket is back in place and the bolts need to be torqued to 85 foot-pounds. It's always a good idea to clean up the bolts before installing them just to make sure the bolts move freely and can achieve the proper clamp load at 85 foot-pounds. The new anti-rattle clips or abutment clips can be a little stubborn to install, and it sometimes helps to use a large screwdriver to gently seat them into the slots. Using one of the old brake pads, I'll use a C-clamp to compress the caliper pistons. I'll apply a very small amount of guide pin grease on the brake tabs. I'll go ahead and install the two 12mm caliper mounting bolts. Even though I changed out the brake fluid a couple of years ago, it needs to be changed out again as the moisture content is over 4%. I'll use a fluid extractor that I built in a previous video to first remove the brake fluid from the master cylinder reservoir. Before bleeding the brakes, I'll fill the reservoir with new brake fluid. I'll slide the 1/4-inch extractor hose onto the end of the bleeder valve and we'll power up the extractor. Now that there's suction for the extractor, we can loosen the bleeder valve and avoid introducing air into the brake line. And the fluid is flowing pretty quickly. So I'll stop and add fluid to the master cylinder to avoid completely draining the reservoir and introducing air into the system. And the brake fluid in the extractor hose is clear and clean. So we're all finished with this axle. I won't show it, but I'll repeat the process for the other rear axle. I'll go ahead and install the fender lining since we're all finished with the repairs that need to be made on this corner of the vehicle. This is the pitman arm. It connects the steering linkage to the steering column. And there's quite a bit of slop and this thing needs replaced. This is the idler arm. It's not quite as worn out as the pitman arm, but it does need to be replaced. And the upper and lower ball joints don't look too bad, but they're definitely getting worn. The steering gearbox is also very sloppy and loose. So when there's a small amount of slop in 12 different components, the steering can become almost dangerously sloppy and loose. The vehicle is off the ground and high enough to offer plenty of clearance. If you're going to crawl under a vehicle, I highly recommend using a jack stand. Just make sure you buy a safe one. I put together a review a while back, and some jack stands are very dangerous. And this vehicle is stable and safe to work under. In addition to sloppy steering, a good indicator that there might be front end wear or alignment issues is tire wear. And this tire is wearing unevenly towards the inside. I'm pretty sure it has both an issue with the alignment as well as front end wear. I'll turn the steering wheel to the left to make it easier to access the caliper guide pin bolts. And the caliper guide pin bolts are still in good shape. I'll use a C-clamp to compress the caliper pistons. This will help us get the caliper off easily. I'll set the caliper up and out of the way so that it won't fall and cause damage. In order to remove the rotor, we need to remove the brake caliper bracket, and these bolts are very tight. Once the two bolts are removed, we can remove the brake caliper bracket and the old brake rotor. Fortunately, the brake rotor isn't stuck and is coming off easily. In order to replace the ball joint, we need to free up the brake line from the steering knuckle. I'll remove the ABS wiring hold downs from the upper control arm and disconnect it. You can use a screwdriver, but a trim removal tool really helps. I'm using a piece of wire to hold up the brake caliper. If you don't have access to a powerful impact wrench, you'll want to loosen the axle nut before lifting the vehicle off the ground. The axle hub is held in place by three 15mm bolts. And the back two axle hub bolts are loose and there's still one to go. And the axle hub is loose and ready to be removed. Fortunately, the axle hub was not rusted onto the knuckle and it came off pretty easily. I installed this axle hub 104,000 miles ago and it's still in pretty good shape. Since I've got this one off, I'll go ahead and put a new one on to hopefully gain another 100,000 trouble-free miles out of this corner of the vehicle. And this tie rod end is original, and I'm looking forward to getting a closer look at its condition. The tie rod is a little loose, but it's in a lot better shape than anticipated for over 300,000 miles. Keeping the front end parts greased has really helped this last. Penetrating oil seemed to help a little with freeing up a stuck bolt, however it really seems to help quite a bit once the bolt is broken free. And the lower ball joint nut is off. I'll go ahead and remove the upper ball joint nut, and then it'll be time for a workout with the sledgehammer and the ball joint joint fork, and the upper ball joint came loose after just a few blows with the sledgehammer. However, I had to really lay into the lower ball joint with the sledgehammer to finally break it loose. And the lower ball joint is pretty loose, but it's actually in pretty good shape considering 300,000 miles of wear and tear. And the upper ball joint is also pretty loose. I bought this ball joint press about 12 years ago and has come in handy several times. I find that I'm more willing to tackle projects if I already have the tools that are needed for the job. However, you don't have to buy one of these, you can typically borrow one from an auto parts store. I'll apply a high quality grease to the threads to protect the threads against galling. The ball joint needs to be pressed up and out. The kit does come with plenty of assorted pieces for just about any scenario. Fortunately, the top ball joint came out without too much trouble. It's pretty loose, but it's still in pretty good shape considering the many miles it's traveled. The upper ball joint does have to be installed in the proper direction to allow the ball joint to articulate in and out freely. Let's clean up the top side of the lower ball joint before we press out the ball joint. There are 4 tabs that stick out. The press can probably overcome the resistance of the 4 tabs, but let's use a hammer and a chisel to flatten them. And the ball joint press made very easy work of the lower ball joint, and it came out much easier than anticipated. And this lower ball joint definitely has more wear and tear than the upper ball joint. I'll use a wire cut brush on a drill to clean up the lower control arm. At least for me, it really helps to have everything cleaned up properly when trying to install a new part. And the ball joint mounting area on the lower and the upper control arm is all cleaned up. And the bore for both the upper and the lower ball joints looks nice and smooth. While there's nothing in the way, let's go ahead and replace the front shock absorber. This is a very quick and easy job with just 1 bolt and 1 nut. I'll use a floor jack to raise the lower control arm to lift the top of the shock into position. The nut and the bolt are installed and we're finished with the front shock. So let's move on to replacing the sway bar link and bushings. And the old sway bar link and bushings are out of the way. And the sway bar link is in place, but I need to lift the lower control arm so that I can install the washer and nut. The sway bar link is supposed to be torqued to 89 inch-pounds. I'll use an inline torque adapter to set the torque. And we're all finished at precisely 89 inch-pounds. Let's install the top ball joint and I'll make sure that it's properly oriented. I'll avoid applying force directly on top of the ball joint where the grease fitting is installed. I'll use this piece that has a cutout in the middle. And the new upper ball joint went in very smoothly and it's fully seated. And cleaning everything up really helped a lot. The new ball joints are secured with a snap ring. I still haven't reviewed snap ring pliers, but it is on my list since I haven't found a really good set yet. And the ball joint dust boot is in place, so let's install the grease fitting. We're all finished up with the upper ball joint, so let's install the lower. And the lower ball joint went in smoothly just as easily as the top. I'll go ahead and install the snap ring to the top. I highly recommend wearing eye protection when working with snap rings. They are very good at escaping snap ring pliers and they usually fly off with quite a force. I'll install the grease fitting and then I'll face it in a direction for easy access once everything is put back together. Before we install the steering knuckle, let's clean it up. This thing is a mess with lots of dirt and rust, and things tend to go back together a lot better if they're all cleaned up. It only takes about 5 minutes to clean up a part like this with a drill and a wire brush. It only takes an extra minute to spray paint it and it'll help prevent future corrosion. And the knuckle looks as good as new. The drive axle is in place, so I'll go ahead and put the ball joints into the proper position. I'll install the lower ball joint nut first, and then I'll use a floor jack under the lower control arm. And the upper control arm is in position and the nut is tight. Let's go ahead and install the new hub assembly. I highly recommend spending a few extra dollars and going with a high quality bearing set. From my experience, a good hub assembly will last over 100,000 miles if the vehicle hasn't been lifted or abused. Let's clean up the brake caliper bolts before we install them. A really gunked up bolt can sometimes provide a lot of resistance. Unfortunately, even when tightened to spec, the bolt might not be providing enough clamp load to properly hold the part in place. And the new front rotors are made by AC Delco and they're pretty affordable, and the same goes with the brake shoes. By the way, I always buy everything and never accept free items or sponsorships. I should be able to install the bolts most of the way by hand and then achieve the proper clamp load. And the new anti-rattle clips are in place and everything is lubed up and ready for installation. I was able to install the bolts most of the way by hand, and the bolts are torqued to 129 foot-pounds. And the new brake pads went into position without a problem. Sometimes the tabs or the slots on really affordable brake pads aren't machined properly and they won't fit unless they're sanded or filed. And the caliper guide pin bolts are installed and torqued to 30 foot-pounds. And the wiring for the ABS sensor is connected and secured to the upper control arm assembly. I'll go ahead and use a new spindle nut just to be safe. I'll snug up the spindle nut for now, and I can torque it to spec once the front wheels are back on the ground. I'll go ahead and add some grease to both of the new ball joints while they're very easy to access. We're on the driver's side of the vehicle and I've already removed the ball joints, caliper, knuckle, and hub. The front axle seal is leaking and needs to be replaced. I could remove the entire axle assembly in one piece, but it's a little easier to manage if broken into two pieces. And the axle stub just popped loose. So let's take a a closer look at the seal. And that seal is definitely in pretty bad shape. A seal puller is a very affordable tool that really helps for extracting old seals. And the seal puller made very easy work of extracting the seal. I highly recommend using a high quality seal, especially if the seal is a challenge to remove. This one should hold up for quite a while. You can use a large socket or even a board to install a seal, but this type of seal installation tool is very helpful, especially in tight spaces like this one. Everything is cleaned up and ready for the new seal. And the new seal went into position without a problem. I'll apply a thin coating of grease to the seal and the axle stub to protect the new seal. A few light taps with the hammer and the axle stub is back in place. I'll go ahead and remove the splash guard on this side of the vehicle since we need to access the bolts to the steering gear box. Let's head under the vehicle and remove the rest of the old steering components. And the pitman arm nut is off. And the nut for the idler arm is off as well. And the 2 bolts for the idler arm bracket are off. So the idler arm can be removed as soon as we remove the pitman arm. And it's a very tight space to work in, but the nut for the pitman arm has been removed. Let's go ahead and remove the fan shroud to gain better access and to allow for a much better view with the camera from the top. I'll also remove the intake hose. And this engine cooling fan clutch is definitely worn out. When the fan clutch wears out, the fan just doesn't move enough air through the air conditioning condenser when the vehicle is at a stop. As a result, the air coming out the air conditioner just isn't very cool. The engine can also overheat when you're stuck in traffic. And the lower fan shroud is out of the way. And both the power steering hoses are off. And the 3 bolts that hold the power steering pump need to be removed before I can get the pitman arm puller onto the pitman arm. Before we do anything else, a very important step is to make sure that the steering wheel is secured so that it won't turn. The clock spring and other things inside the steering column can get destroyed if the steering wheel is turned too many times in either direction. And the pitman arm is off the steering gear and the old worn out steering gear is out. I'll go ahead and remove the rest of the front end parts all in one piece. All the way to the left and the right are the outer tie rods, then the inner tie rods. The idler arm and the pitman arm are in the middle. When one adds up all the moving parts, including the ball joints, there are 12 joints that can experience wear. A small amount of wear in 12 different places, along with the worn out steering gearbox, will really cause some sloppy steering. Even though we are replacing both the inner and the outer tie rods, I'll go ahead and count the number of rotations it takes to remove the old tie rod. Installing the new tie rod ends to the same number of turns will really help when it's time to do a front end alignment. And the new inner and outer tie rods are in place on both ends. It's always a good idea to compare the old and the new parts just to make sure that they're the same. I'll transfer the new return line fitting to the new power steering pump. The new power steering pump came with new O-rings for both hoses. And the new power steering pump looks the same as the old one and it's ready to be installed. All 3 bolts have been threaded into the power steering pump. However, I'll wait to tighten them until all the other front end components are in place and attached. And the spline on the pitman arm do have to line up with the power steering pump. I'll tighten the nut just a little, but I will wait to tighten the nut to spec once everything is attached. I'll go ahead and install the new idler arm bracket. I'll also go ahead and tighten the 2 bolts that mount the idler arm to the frame. The inner and outer tie rod assembly is ready to be installed. And the front center link is attached to the idler arm and the pitman arm. I still have a little bit more work before I tighten the nuts. And the steering shaft is connected to the power steering gearbox. Since just about everything is in place, I'll go ahead and tighten all the nuts and bolts and install the cotter pins. And the tie rods are attached to the knuckle. So the front end work is just about finished. And it's nice to see the front wheels going back on this vehicle again. However, we still have quite a bit of work to do before we go for a test drive. I'll add some more power steering fluid since we did lose quite a bit of fluid while the hoses were disconnected. Before we install the fan clutch, let's replace the belt tensioner pulley. I've already replaced the idler pulley, so I won't replace it now. I'll keep on using the serpentine belt since I recently replaced it and it's still in good shape. Idler and tensioner bearings usually become noisy before they fail, but that's not always the case. This is a very affordable part, so I'll go ahead and install the new one and it should be good for another 100,000 miles. Before we install the fan shroud and the cooling fan, let's do some of the work under the hood while those things are out of the way. I'll go ahead and change out the front differential fluid. The differential holds just under 2 quarts and I'll be using a fully synthetic gear oil. Gravity is always an issue when adding fluid from underneath the vehicle, and I really like using these fluid pumps. They thread right onto the oil container. And the front differential is full, so let's move back about 3 feet and change the oil while we're underneath the vehicle. I usually recommend to others that they stay with the oil viscosity recommended by the vehicle manufacturer. However, Rotella T6 15W40 is a pretty good option for this engine since it has over 300,000 miles. The extra anti-wear additives, detergents, and dispersants found in the motor oil designed for a diesel will really help this engine keep going. For a vehicle with 4-wheel drive, it's a good idea to keep up with the fluid changes on the transfer case. This transfer case holds 1.9 quarts and it uses GM's AutoTrack fluid that's designed for automatic transfer cases. And the new cooling fan clutch should really help improve the performance of the air conditioner when in traffic. No overheating issues with this engine, but it it will definitely prevent those from occurring in the future. And the lower half of the fan shroud is in place. And the fan is back in place, so I'll use a hammer to tap and tighten the nut. It's been around 50,000 miles since I last changed the spark plugs and spark plug wires. They could last a little bit longer, but let's go ahead and replace them as well. And the spark plug doesn't look too bad, but there is a small amount of carbon buildup on part of the spark plug. I'll replace the platinum spark plugs with an iridium spark plug, which should offer a little bit longer service life. I'll apply some dielectric grease around the ceramic part of the spark plug, and the spark plugs are ready to be installed. I'll hand tighten the spark plugs just to make sure that I don't start them off cross-threaded. All of the spark plugs have been changed out. I recommend going with either an OEM or a high-quality aftermarket spark plug wire. Cheap ignition components can cause performance issues. I probably can't align the wheels as accurately as a shop with the proper equipment, but I can get pretty close. I want the front wheels to be resting on the ground, but they need to be able to turn easily as I make adjustments. You could stack one piece of cardboard on top of the other, but I'm using two pieces of plexiglass with grease in the middle. I'll place them directly under the front wheels. On each side of the vehicle, I'll use two cement blocks and some string connecting them. And the string is precisely 3 inches outward from the center of the wheel for all 4 wheels. And the steering wheel is centered, and the wheels are pointing as straight forward as possible. I'll be measuring the distance from the forward and rear section of the rim. At the rear side of the wheel, it's about 2 11/16 of an inch, and 3 1/4 inches at the front. So this side of the vehicle is trying to steer to the left, and the most forward part of the passenger side front wheel is close to 3 1/4 inches. The rear side of the wheel is at 2 3/4. So this side of the vehicle is trying to make a right turn while the other side is trying to turn left. If I didn't do anything, this would destroy the tires quickly and be a very sketchy and scary vehicle to drive. I'll go ahead and loosen both tie rods, and I'll begin adjusting both sides to point straight ahead. When we're all finished, the front wheels do need to be pointed inward by about 1/16 of an inch. And I made quite a few adjustments and measurements, and we're all set. I'll move the wheels to the left and the right just a little bit, and then we'll make one more measurement. And everything is all set up, so I'll go ahead and tighten the lock nuts on both sides. Let's check the freon level in the vehicle. You don't really need 2 gauges to check the freon level. Just the low pressure side is all you need. This test is most accurate if the engine is cooled off and not running. And the temperature inside the shop is 73 degrees Fahrenheit, but the pressure is at around 66 to 67 psi. So it should be around 75 psi, so I need to add some freon. I went ahead and added a little bit of freon, and the system is fully charged. Let's use the fluid extractor to remove the old transmission fluid. By the way, having spoken with people who work at dealership service departments, it's a pretty common practice to use this approach to exchange transmission and differential fluid if there isn't a drain plug. I typically exchange 3 quarts of transmission fluid every 2nd or 3rd oil change. That's probably one of the reasons why this transmission is still working so well at over 300,000 miles on the original transmission. And the transmission is good to go, so let's go ahead and clean the mass airflow sensor. One wiring connector and a couple of hose clamps, and the mass sensor is out. Over time, the filaments on the sensor can become dirty, and then the sensor provides less than optimal data to the ECU. If you decide to do this, I recommend using mass airflow sensor cleaner and avoid using other solvents since they can cause damage. Little things like this really help improve the performance and efficiency of a vehicle, and the sensor looks as clean as new. Let's go ahead and install the new upper half of the fan shroud as well as the intake hose. I got a little ahead of myself, and I should have changed out the air filter while I had the air hose disconnected. Let's vacuum out and try to clean up the inside of the air box just a little. I reviewed air filters a while back, and a high quality air filter does indeed catch more dust and dirt than a low quality one. Let's change out the headlight bulbs since these haven't been changed out in over 10 years and many hours of use. GM did a great job with this headlight design. You simply pull out 2 pins and the headlight comes out. This only takes about 2 minutes, even if you're not in a hurry. I changed out the thermostat about a year ago, and I also changed out the antifreeze. Let's check it again anyway using these test strips to see if it's still in good shape. I've taped the test strip to a zip tie so we can get it down into the pressure tank. And the glycol percentage appears to be good at around 60%. Fortunately, the antifreeze is still good and it's not acidic with a pH of around 9. Let's test the health of the battery using this electronic battery tester. And this battery is only at 12.25 volts and needs to be charged, but the tester indicates that the battery is still in good shape. At only 570 amps, that'll definitely improve once the battery is charged. SO8 stands for state of health, and the battery is still in pretty good shape at 72%. The state of charge just means that the battery is at 56% charged and below 12.6 volts. I charged the battery overnight and the battery is fully charged. And the cranking amps did indeed go up to 668 or almost 100 more. A dirty fuel filter or one that's plugged can cause a lot of wear and tear on a fuel pump. I recently changed this one out, so I won't change it this time. It's also a really good idea to change the rear differential fluid. And there are 10 bolts that fasten the differential cover. In order to get a good seal, both mating surfaces have to be squeaky clean. So I'll remove all the old gasket material, then I'll clean it up with brake parts cleaner. I'll apply some RTV gasket maker, and then I'll install the cover. I'll leave the bolts finger tight for now until the gasket material begins to harden. And the RTV gasket maker's had plenty of time to cure. I'll go ahead and tighten the bolts using a crossing pattern. The fill port is located on the front and upper side of the differential differential. I'll add 3 quarts of gear oil and the differential should be good to go for another 50,000 miles. With the driver's side tire on the ground and the passenger side off the ground, there was a lot of slop in the steering before all of the work. All 12 points of wear in both hubs have been replaced and there's no more slop in the steering. Very impressive. I'll go ahead and wash the vehicle and then use a ceramic coating to protect the paint finish. And this vehicle actually doesn't look too bad for over 300,000 miles and 21 years of use. I'll save at least $1,000 a month keeping this one instead of buying a brand new Suburban. As Cousin Eddie likes to say, it's cheaper to keep her. Let's take this thing for a drive. And the steering is so much better and the vehicle drives straight as it should. And the steering is also much more responsive to driver input. Should I slow the videos down or should I keep the same pace? We packed a lot into about 25 or 26 minutes. I try to keep these videos moving as quickly as possible to keep people from getting bored and moving on to other things. All the videos in this channel, including this one, are viewer suggested. So if you have a video idea, I hope you'll take time to leave a comment. Thanks so much for watching. Please take care and look forward to next time.